So Finnish game developers Remedy Entertainment have a long history of flippy-flopping all over the place. In terms of high-profile releases, they started out incredibly strong in both a gameplay and narrative sense with the first couple Max Payne games. Maybe we'll talk about that series in the future. Then they cranked out Alan Wake and Alan Wake's American Nightmare in the early 2010s, which had pretty interesting worlds and stories that translated into some pretty fucking mid gameplay. After that, they made that half-game, half-TV show thing, Quantum Break, which was a perfectly okay third-person shooter, providing a lot of the skeleton for the game we're talking about today, mixed with a bunch of narrative which was so uninteresting that even though I'm positive I beat it at one point, I remember almost nothing about it. And I think that probably says more than a synopsis really could. I haven't played Alan Wake 2 because I'm pretty sure I'd get like 11 frames a second from it. So instead of that, I want to talk about the Remedy game that I think has the somewhat rare distinction of being every bit as good as its diehard fans say it is. Control sets out to answer the question, what if we took the cosmic unknown, the endless possibilities of parallel universes, and filtered it all through the lens of intense government bureaucracy? I'll be the first to acknowledge that that isn't the most immediately gripping premise. I think it would have been really easy for this game to turn out a total fucking mess, which is why I'm impressed by how strong of an identity this setting has. Now, the game starts out as a pretty jarring mystery in every respect, but when the credits roll some 20 to 25 hours later, it's a mystery that you've just kind of accepted. I could understand someone slapping the classic label of all style, no substance on it. In fact, I think I've seen people do exactly that, and I certainly don't think that's right, but I do think the style itself is like 50% of the substance. I mean, this game is so goddamn stylish, so inventive in the portrayal of its premise. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's take it back down to the foundation. You play as one Jesse Faden, a loner and drifter who's been led by an otherworldly energy residing in her head to the oldest house, where the Federal Bureau of Control is located. Now, the oldest house is right smack in the center of New York City, but it's hidden from the general public by some ethereal force that essentially boils down to magic from another dimension. I don't think we need to get too far into the weeds on that. The fact of the matter is that the Bureau didn't build this place. Assumedly, no one built this place. The oldest house is a paranatural entity in its own right, seemingly alive, and no different from the dozens of other interdimensionally cursed objects that the Bureau holds and studies within it. Throughout Jesse's journey around the oldest house, part of the mystery subsides in the sense that you learn a lot about the Bureau's perspective on alternate dimensions and the implications of the artifacts they find. You know, at best, they can manipulate objects to achieve a desired effect without really understanding why these things work. But more than anything, you just come to realize that the Bureau barely knows what the fuck is going on here themselves. They observe these paranatural phenomena and assign labels to things based on their best guesses, like any proper government official. I mean, the sheer volume of literature lying around containing details of the Bureau's many studies is staggering, and a lot of it is really interesting and creative, but the majority of it boils down to, we don't know, and frankly, we find it a little fucking scary. And it should be made clear that that's entirely by design. I think the worst thing Control could have tried to do was lay out a perfect little explanation for all of the haunted house shenanigans that the oldest house is plagued by. Because even though we play as an absolute girl boss with every crazy superpower in the book, specifically chosen by a higher interdimensional entity of immense power, we're still just human, and some things are simply beyond our comprehension. But getting back to that girl boss, I'm not going to do a super thorough backstory explanation on her or really any of the major characters, not so much because I care whether I spoil things, but because I think they're the least interesting aspects of the game by design. This is very much not a character drama, even though some aspects of one wiggle their way in at times for the sake of plot consistency. We get a loose idea of why Jessie wanted to find the Bureau, and it's to find her brother, but then this motivation is pretty well ignored for like the first third of the game in favor of hammering home the intrigue of the oldest house and the threat the Bureau faces. I think it's clear that the devs needed to make sure the player was a force from outside of the Bureau coming in order to maintain a sense of mystery, and that use as a narrative tool is ultimately more important than any theme or character arc that Jessie could guide us through. But I'll give the brief rundown anyway. That entity in Jessie's head came from a dimension that she accessed as a child when she and her brother were playing with a cursed old slide projector in the local dump. That entity is ultimately a nice lady, but pretty much everything else the kids opened the door to was rather malicious, one of which assumedly killed every adult in their small town. The Bureau came to clean the mess up, and Jessie tried to run from them with her little brother, but the Bureau got their hands on him and she ultimately left him behind. She feels pretty fucking guilty about that, but strangely, this doesn't really translate into anger towards the Bureau. She arrives in the house, sees some trippy shit, is named the Bureau's director and given cool powers, and then just sets out to help everyone, with her brother's well-being kinda serving as a long-term goal or an afterthought for a considerable stretch of time. I'm not willing to consider this a severe writing flaw or anything, because having weird pacing is almost inevitable when it comes to video game narratives, and we could just chalk it up to her being a relentlessly nice person, because that really is like her whole shtick. If you understand the concept of being friendly and polite, congratulations, you've got like 90% of Jessie Faden figured out pretty well. As far as character progression, the only tangible bit we get is a major uptick in her confidence, learning to take control, if you would, as her role within the Bureau gradually molds her from a meek and unassuming loner into the girl boss she was always meant to be. I swear I'm not fucking with you on this. I'm pretty sure the words, "the power was inside me all along," literally come out of her fucking mouth, because Jessie Faden is a comic book character. But now that the stage is set, the actual threat that has turned the Bureau upside down, causing the death of most employees, including the former director and the head of research, is called the Hiss. Essentially, the Hiss is like a hostile radio frequency that takes over physical hosts and bends them to its will. The Hiss came out of the slide projector that the Bureau recovered in the same way that Jessie's friendly entity did, and in fact they're almost shown to be two sides of the same coin, with Jessie and any survivors being alive because of the friendly entity's ability to fight the Hiss off. So anyway, this means that the bulk of Control's enemies are humanoid in nature, as I'm sure you've been able to see. Some fly, some even teleport, and some have fucking rocket launchers, but the majority of them are just Bureau employees who've been corrupted and need to be put down. So they provide the base gameplay, but they're not what makes the oldest house a treat to explore. The real intrigue comes from the glimpses into other dimensions and what the game calls objects of power, or OOPs. These are seemingly innocuous items that have become imbued with energy from beyond our dimension and, as such, get a little fucking wild. Some of these were dangerous to begin with, while some were merely unnatural, but now that the Hiss has control over them, their behavior becomes downright erratic, so you'll end up doing battle or playing mind games with things like an angry fridge, an antisocial anchor, and a very fast rubber duck. Jessie has the ability to purge these objects of the Hiss's influence in a way that no one else can, and so purge you must. But just like we mentioned earlier, the most fantastic of all the OOPs is undoubtedly the oldest house itself. A nearly endless expanse of living concrete and brutalist Cold War vibes, the house is being taken over by the Hiss as well, and entire wings of the building are closing in and devouring themselves. Killing everything in sight and laying claim to the region is the only way to get the oldest house acting right again. Frankly, I know this will sound like a total cop-out, but even though I've made a decent effort, I do think the setting of Control is really hard to do justice to with words, or even by putting my own footage of different weird shit on screen, because discovery is such a huge part of the experience. It's like, people can tell you that Fallout New Vegas has a bunch of different vaults where weird experiments were performed. They can explain to you the basis of these experiments. They can even show you the vault and the result of these experiments. But that doesn't come anywhere close to communicating what it's like to discover Vault 22 for the first time. You know what I'm saying? Playing Control is like finding Vault 22, except over and over again. And you know what? I think I'll leave that there. Alright, now for the fun part. You can probably guess by the general tone of the video that I think the gameplay is fantastic and this section will be overwhelmingly positive. So I figure we should start with the aspects of the gameplay that are not great. Number one being the boss fights. Some of these have spectacle figured out down to a T, but basically none of them are actually good as combat encounters, outside of one at the end of a DLC. At best, they're tolerable, and at worst, they are the most annoying part of the playthrough. It's a shame because the incredibly fluid and chaotic flow of the game's combat could have lended itself really well to some intense and tightly choreographed battles in the hands of developers who specialized in that sort of thing. But instead they tend to fall back on annoying, tedious mechanics, god-tier damage, and sponginess to create the challenge. Number 2 is an aspect of the game that I actually enjoy, but I can kind of understand the vitriol towards, and that is general travel and the game's map. The game doesn't fuck around with things like a precise quest marker or one of those compasses at the top of the screen to guide you right where you need to go. Usually, when you get a mission to explore an area, you need to actually find the area by reading signs and referencing the static map, which only highlights entire zones as your area of interest. And I think this encourages you to really engage with your environment and be on the lookout for things that'll catch your eye and lead to secrets being uncovered. There's a few instances where they try to get cute and spread mission objectives across a bunch of weird hidden spots, and especially in larger zones, this turns exploration from something organic and interesting into something tedious and stupid. But overall, I enjoy the style and what it says about Remedy's confidence in the world they created. Now, the map itself does have some problems. The Oldest House has a huge degree of verticality to it, which I love, but the map does a horrible job of communicating where everything fits into this vertical structure. Relying on it will get you lost on a couple occasions. Now, it's not Bioshock 1 and 2 levels of fucking eye cancer by any means, but it is just simple in a way that doesn't do justice to the game world's impressive layout. And, is tangibly worse than even most real-world maps covering a multi-floor building. And, that's about it for negatives. The core gameplay is an absolute fucking blast. Jesse starts out with an OOP called the Service Weapon, which you can unlock 5 different firing modes for, and it self-reloads after a short delay, eliminating the need for ammo pickups or really any resource management. This is balanced out with the Force Push and Force Throw that she receives shortly after. Basically, you can mag dump, and by the time you've used a couple of telekinetic abilities afterwards, your mag is full again. You are never made to cower and never without combat options, and this has only turned up several more clicks as you unlock modifications for the service weapon and find new telekinetic abilities like the rock shield, mind control, and fucking flying. Your offensive, defensive, and movement options are incredibly varied, and movement in particular feels too good to even be completely legal. On one hand, all of your actions have a real sense of weight behind them, from the punchiness of attacks to the way even your short dash disrupts the world around you. But you also slide around all buttery fucking smooth-like, and always have the capability to stay a step ahead of the opposition. Jesse Faden is an extremely powerful whirlwind of magical violence, but the game employs just enough combat features to keep control from becoming a full-on power fantasy. First and foremost, you are not super tanky. If you're not constantly on the move, there's a very good chance you'll find yourself melted by the impeccably accurate aim of the Hiss soldiers in a short time span. This is combined with the fact that the only means of regenerating health in combat is to suck up the Healy crystals that enemies drop when damaged. And this kind of pushes combat from being a thing where speed and aggression is an option to a thing where it really is the only way to play, which I love. There's enough variety between styles of enemy defenses and attacks that you can't really go on full autopilot and just enjoy the destruction around you without thought when you're in an encounter that matches your level. Which is good because the Force Throw is one of the most satisfying and destructive abilities that gaming has ever granted me, and if it wasn't tempered by the fact that it's tied to a limited energy stock and most flying enemies can evade it, I might very well have just spammed it the entire game. Speaking of destruction, the environments of the Oldest House kind of invoke comparison to games like the original Fear, and how everything can be torn apart and blown up. Not in the way that like a battlefield map can be blown apart and actually change the landscape, just in the purely aesthetic sense, and in about as extreme of a fashion as you can get while sticking to just aesthetics. If you don't have anything in particular targeted when you want to perform a force throw, for example, Jesse just rips a chunk of concrete out of the oldest house's walls to use as ammo, and the shield ability literally tears up the floor around you to form a barricade. Electronics and anything containing any sort of fuel or pressure blow up with fantastic sound effects when messed with, stray bullets are constantly beating dust and debris up, and plants blow apart into 100 individual leaves when shot. I think you probably get the idea. As for the exploration side of things, there's this very light Metroidvania component, where areas you've already visited reveal themselves to be much larger than originally thought once you acquire new abilities like the dash or levitation. And this creates some really neat moments on several occasions. Like I said, exploration is such a huge source of the satisfaction you'll get from this game. I think it's helped further by the fact that the game already feels adequate without the additional areas you can go back and access. They're usually used as little rewards for inquisitive players rather than something the game demands you find. The game's puzzles, of which there are a decent amount, vary in difficulty and in how intuitively they're presented to the player pretty substantially, but they tend to boil down to a combination of basic pattern recognition and closely observing your environment. The latter more so than the former, probably. The solution to most problems is staring you right in the face once you figure out where to look. Now, we touched on progression a little bit earlier, but it's not very complex in this title, so we might as well be as thorough as the game allows. There's a small number of brand new abilities unlocked within the skill tree, I want to say 2 or 3, but in general the focus is on choosing what aspects of the core combat you want to be slightly more proficient in. And I think the games with the most satisfying progression tend to have a very simple core that you build upon in the way that you want through selective use of upgrades. I play a lot of RPGs, so I'd say I'm particularly prone to enjoying that approach. And Control doesn't really do this, but it works because the core of the game is already stuffed fucking full of variety. It means that character progression is rather shallow, technically speaking, but that really isn't something I even noticed throughout my 2 playthroughs of the game. Until I was forced to start thinking about it for the sake of making an honest video, it never occurred to me at all, and I kinda doubt it's something that will hinder your experience with the game either. Now, this video script originally included a bit of info about the game's 2 DLC expansions, one of which is a full-blown Alan Wake crossover event, if that's the kind of thing that gets you going. But I think those rambles might work better as their own video if that's something that the people want, similar to what I did for Minerva's Den. So we'll set those aside for right now. With all that said, I don't really want to close out with another fucking weird Fallout analogy or something poetic about the power of video games. So instead, I'll recap college essay style. Control is unambitious with its main narrative. I think there's missed potential there, especially when some members of the supporting cast were so interesting. But the fundamental premise of the setting in all its strangeness, and how the game goes about exploring that, is something close to a masterclass, and Remedy's penchant for visual flair certainly makes the game stand out from the pack. And the gameplay is fucking sweet 100% of the time that it isn't being annoying. I think Control is cool and fun, and I think Remedy are very creative developers, and I think you might find it fun as well. I'll talk to you guys later.